In today's video, I'll be discussing a hypothetical 2028 presidential election prediction between Cory Booker and JD Vance. We probably all know who these two candidates are. JD Vance, of course, being the current vice president, while Cory Booker being a senator, a Democratic senator that is from the state of New Jersey. Both of these candidates have relatively high name recognition and are potential candidates in 2028. On the Republican side here, we see that Vance has a pretty big advantage over all other candidates, albeit it is still early. While Cory Booker is not considered necessarily the frontrunner, if you look at the race in the White House aggregate without Kamala Harris, he is tied for second place behind Pete Buttigieg and tied with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, suggesting that Cory Booker has a realistic shot of winning the Democratic nomination. So without further ado, let's get right into today's video. So first off, we have Cory Booker and his safe states. The West Coast as well as the East Coast are both considered safe regions for Cory Booker, so are the states of Illinois and as well as Hawaii. So that pretty much wraps it up, along with Maine's 1st Congressional District, areas that expect Cory Booker to win by more than 12%. JD Vance has his safe states as well. This is not very surprising. Of course, some of this could fluctuate based on what happens before 2028, which party is more popular, whether Cory Booker or JD Vance has any scandals and stuff, but this is roughly where you would expect the election to kind of land with the safe states. Now I'm going to go to the likely states here, starting with JD Vance, because he is currently behind. Alaska is not really expected to be competitive. JD Vance will easily cruise to victory there. Florida, I'm debating between a likely or safe margin. It was safe by my margins in 2024 when Trump won it by 13.1%. However, I think Trump is uniquely strong in Florida, albeit we have seen that Republicans have consistently overperformed there. I would say it's a Vance plus 10 victory. Vance does come from the state of Ohio, which is in the Midwest, while Florida is kind of Trump's home state. Trump resides and votes in the state of Florida, so I would give that as likely Republican. Now we go to the state of Texas. Texas will probably also be likely Republican. I don't think it's going to be a safe state, just because I think 2024 was slightly a fluke there, as if the state has been trending blue up until 2024, where we saw that Trump was able to win the state by 13.7. Realistically, I expect, someone like JD Vance to perhaps not do as well in some of the suburban areas like Tarrant County, and perhaps slightly underperformed in the Hispanic-dominant Rio Grande Valley. Nevertheless, this will easily be a JD Vance victory, unlike what some people have speculated to be Blue Texas in 2028, so likely Republican. Ohio and Iowa doesn't require much explanation. They could be considered candidates for safe Republican. However, I do feel as though 12% more than that margin is kind of difficult for JD Vance, as again, Trump is uniquely strong in some of these Midwestern states where he has a unique working class coalition. Now, obviously, some like JD Vance will still hang on to most of it, but even losing a few voters would indicate that Vance will probably not be able to win those states by more than 12%. Although those states are historically more competitive states, it does seem like they're heavily trending away from the Democrats and towards the Republican Party, as these are working class dominant states which favor the Republicans now. I would say Maine second as well, likely Republican. I wouldn't go safe, but this is not going to be a competitive district. Now we go to Cory Booker and his likely states. Colorado, New Mexico, if you look at the 2024 margins, they're not really going to be competitive. New Mexico is kind of close in 2024, but I don't expect that the Latino vote to continuously trend heavily Republican, and thus I would expect that some Democrat, in this case Cory Booker, should win New Mexico without a problem. So that's that. I would also expect Virginia to be likely Democratic. Virginia was slightly over 5% for Harris, and the suburban vote is very Democratic. Thus, I would expect its state to be likely Democrat. I would also expect Maine, as well as Nebraska second, to be likely Democrat. Maine is just a state where it has consistently voted Democratic. It's been getting closer. In 2024, it was only a 6.9% margin. But I do expect the state to still vote Democratic by heavy margins, because Portland is still a very big city compared to the state's size, and I still expect a lot of those areas to vote Democratic. Nebraska's second has been trending blue for a long time. I know that wasn't the case in 2020 to 2024, however, that was because of redistricting. The district became 3 points more Republican, yet only trended 2 points to the Republican Party, suggesting that Nebraska's second is still heavily shifting blue. Now we go to the final states on this map, the lean and tilt states, which will decide who wins the election. It's now time to fill in the lean and tilt states, starting with the state of Nevada. Nevada really comes down to one county, being Clark County, which is roughly about 65% of the state's population, and it's a county where about 25% of its residents are Latino/Hispanic, and that is the crucial demographic across the state. That group of voters make up 25% of the statewide population and traded 15 points away from the Democratic Party in 2024. If it wasn't for that group of voters, Kamala Harris would have won the state. The question is, how will Latino voters vote in 2028? While I do believe that Cory Booker would do better than Kamala Harris did in 2024, I don't believe it's going to be enough. At the end of the day, Clark County is heavily trending away from Democrats, and so are Hispanic voters. It's going to be difficult to completely reverse that trend. Even if Cory Booker does a little bit better, he still has to overcome a 46,000 vote deficit across Nevada, which is difficult given the state's overall population. Thus, I would have to say Nevada goes tilt in the JD Vance column. Another state I do believe does favor JD Vance right now is the state of Arizona. While the state has been trending blue over the past few election cycles, the trend seems to have reversed in 2024, where Donald Trump won the state by over 5%, in fact by over 5.5% in the state of Arizona. It still will be expected to be a pretty competitive race, and the state was largely kind of influenced by the border crisis, where a lot of Mexicans were trying to cross illegally into the United States, and that was a pretty big issue for a lot of Arizona voters, causing specifically some of the border counties, Santa Cruz County, Yuma County, to shift heavily to the Republican Party. However, Democrats have more fundamental issues across the state. There are many kind of Native American reservations across the state. Apache County is a great example. Santa Cruz County is another example, right? These Native American congregated regions are generally speaking more Democratic, but they seem to have shifted heavily away from Democrats in 2024, something that is not expected to reverse in 2028. Also, these suburban voters, they have to come in quite universally for the Democratic Party, as in Biden won the state because he won like 80% of the truly moderate vote across Arizona. While Democrats are expected to win the majority of those voters, it's hard to fathom how Democrats could consistently vote with Joe Biden's numbers, especially because Trump was uniquely controversial in Arizona, yet still won the state by over 5%, suggesting the state probably won't be that competitive, at least not as competitive as Nevada or within like a 2% margin in 2028. Now we go to Georgia. Georgia, interestingly, despite voting for Donald Trump, was considered one of the better performances for Kamala Harris because the state only shifted 2.5% to the Republican Party. Not bad for Democrats in Georgia because the national environment trended 6 points away from the Democratic Party and towards Donald Trump, suggesting that the state actually kind of shifted 3.5% Democratic relative to the national environment, and Democrats have an edge in some of the exurban counties because despite the fact that the state did shift to the Republicans, we still saw some exurban counties around Atlanta shift Democratic. And Republicans, a bonus for Democrats, are kind of maxed out in the rural areas. Upton County is 70% Republican, Effingham County is 74% Republican, Lee County is 72% Republican. It doesn't seem as though Republicans can gain a lot of votes from those regions, while Democrats are not really maxed out in areas like Cobb or Gwinnett County. That being said, Cory Booker is not that well liked in the South, especially with rural voters, and his name recognition right now is not as high, and he's not as popular in the South. He's more popular in the North. Thus, I would think that the state of Georgia might still nearly vote for the Republican Party. It's still going to be very close. But again, Trump is uniquely not as popular in Georgia and toxic to some suburban voters. Having JD Vance on the top of the ballot, even though some suburban voters don't like him either, might still sway a few voters towards the Republican side, suggesting that Georgia might still be tilt Republican, albeit this is a difficult call. Now we go to North Carolina, where again there's an interesting race, but the state has not voted for a Democrat since 2008. In addition, the state isn't really trending toward the Democratic Party, and there are certainly some areas, specifically the more rural areas of the state around Charlotte, in this part of the state, as well as some of these areas bordering the state of Virginia, are actually trending to the Republicans. While Democrats have made minor gains in recent years in this urban areas like Wayne County as well as Mecklenburg County, it doesn't seem like it's going to be enough, and the state did vote for Trump by over 3%, suggesting that, JD Vance still has to JD Vance still has to lose a considerable portion of the electorate to actually lose the state. All things considered, I would still give the state to tilt Republican, albeit it is still a very competitive race. I'm going to get rid of New Hampshire here. It's going to be lead Democratic. It's a very college-educated state. It's a state where I expect Cory Booker to do well in, especially because he is from this region of the United States. I also think that Minnesota is going to be too far gone for the Republican Party. While Republicans did improve in Minnesota, there's still, Minneapolis is still roughly, 20% of the state's population, and it's 70% Democratic. We go Ramsey County, another 5 to 10% of the state's population, also 70% Democratic. The rural areas across the state are not as conservative, as in, while Republicans have some room to improve in some of those regions, they're not necessarily good enough for them to actually win the state. And these rural areas, although we talk about how small pockets of Republican votes do add up, it's not enough to combat these very urban areas and very liberal votes, not to mention that Minnesota is one of the most progressive states in the United States. Thus, I do not expect the state to vote for the Republicans, and is still considered leaning Democratic. Now let's go to the Rust Belt states. We see that Cory Booker is at 226 electoral votes, while JD Vance is at 268, 2 away from the presidency, and only 1 state away from winning the presidential election. We're going to start off here with Wisconsin, which is considered the best state out of the 3 Rust Belt states for a Democratic Party. Democrats only lost the state by less than 30,000 votes back in 2024. Now, if you look at it, Democrats have 2 major pockets, Dane County as well as Milwaukee County, which account for about 30% of the state's overall electorate. These areas will vote heavily Democratic, but instead the contention will be in the rural areas and the wild counties. In 2024, for example, we saw that Waukesha voted for Trump by 19.7%. But in 2008, despite the overall national environment being about 9% more favorable for Democrats, McCain won the county by 26, and this is not a small county either. This is a county home to more than 270,000 voters back in 2024, so it's really significant. Democrats need to hold those wild county numbers down for the Republican Party in order to win the state of Wisconsin. But more strikingly is the rural areas across the state. This is what drove Barack Obama to a 15% margin victory in Wisconsin back in 2008. It was the rural areas. I'm going to give you an example. Price County, Wisconsin voted for Obama by 13.4%, but voted for Trump by 31.1%. The question is, will Vance in this scenario be able to hold those rural areas? My opinion is no. I think he's obviously going to sweep the rurals, but I also believe that the margins will tighten by a few percent. Given that the state was decided by 30,000 votes or not 0.83%, those few percent shifts will significantly impact the dynamics of the race. And I also don't believe JD Vance is particularly strong in the wild counties. Sure, we might see some regression on the Democratic Party's part in the big urban areas, but I ultimately think that the rural areas kind of overwhelm the shift, and as such, I do believe the state will go for the Democratic Party. Not to mention the national environment back in 2024 was R plus 1.3, but Wisconsin voted R plus 0.8, suggesting the state actually votes to the left of the nation, which is good news for the Democratic Party. I'm going to give Wisconsin right now as about a state Cory Booker would win by about 1.5%. Now we go to the state of Michigan. Michigan was less competitive compared to the state of Wisconsin, and Democrats in this case really flopped in one county, being Wayne County. Wayne County is about 15, maybe 13% of the state's overall population and electorate, and we saw that Harris won 63% of the vote there. You might say that's impressive, but in reality, there were some warning signs for the Democratic Party in Michigan, specifically in Dearborn, where there's a massive Arab American population. A lot of those voters there decided to write in Jill Stein or just take Jill Stein's name, which is why Stein got over 20,000 votes here, and a lot of those voters, Arab Americans being 70% Democratic back in 2020, decided to vote for Donald Trump. This was the big reason why Democrats lost the state. If Wake County did not shift, Democrats would have been within about 0.5% or like 30,000 votes from winning the state, but instead Democrats lost the state overall by more than 100,000 votes, I believe. I'm gonna have to check to make sure. Oh, about 80,000. But either way, it was Detroit that made the huge difference. However, I do believe Democrats will gain a little bit in Detroit just because the Arab American vote is shifting back to Democrats a little bit after many Arab Americans thought that Trump would be a better alternative to Joe Biden or the Democratic Party on the Israel-Palestinian war. A lot of those voters supported Palestine, but Trump is even harsher on these Arab Americans, and I believe that that could help the Democratic Party win them back. Not to mention that the national environment was very favorable for the Republicans in 2024. It's hard to see that same trajectory occurring in 2028. Finally, again, I think Vance will see some regression to rural areas, even in a suburban area like Macomb, which is Trump is specifically very strong in. Now, an area where Democrats could see some regression, for example, is Oakland County. Obama won the county by like 8% in 2012, despite him winning the state overall by nearly 10%, and Harris actually won by a larger margin. We could see these suburbs regressing a little bit for the Democratic Party, but I think Michigan overall is a tilt Democratic characterization, about D plus 1.5, similarly to the state of Wisconsin. Now we go to Pennsylvania, the election decider as always. So in Pennsylvania back in 2024, this was the tipping point state, I believe. Actually, no, the tipping point state in 2024 was the state of Wisconsin, but this is the state that I think will decide the presidential election once and for all again. Pennsylvania, the big three things to really look at is the rural areas again, the working class suburban areas, as well as Philadelphia. Now, a good advantage Republicans had in Pennsylvania back in 2024 was that Democrats lost ground in Philadelphia and the working class regions of the state. These are the more Democratic areas of the state. These are the more Republican rural areas. Republicans did make significant gains in the rural areas, but Democrats saw some pretty substantial losses in their more urban regions. Now, Republicans had a fundamental advantage in Pennsylvania that they do not have in Wisconsin and Michigan. In Wisconsin and Michigan, historically, a lot of rural areas have actually voted for the Democratic Party. However, in 2008, even when Barack Obama had a very massive advantage in Pennsylvania, the rural areas were still very conservative. 2012, even more conservative, and in 2016, we saw that the rural areas were overwhelmingly a sweep just for Donald Trump. And that's where, this does kind of eliminate the rural areas from the picture. Sure, we see that someone like McCain would not be able to win the rurals as much as Trump, but the rural areas is expected to stay for the Republican Party. The question is, what happens in the suburbs? Specifically, areas like Bucks County, which are more white working class, white collar, and those areas kind of shifted away from the Democratic Party back in 2024. Personally, this is a trend that's been happening for a very long time. Working class voters are shifting away from the Democratic Party, thanks to Trump, but also thanks to the trajectory overall. I don't expect that to change, which would be a massive advantage for the Republican Party. Finally, a big problem for Democrats across Pennsylvania and some of the other Democratic states is the loss of urban support, specifically in Philadelphia. In 2020, for example, Biden lost 5 points in Philadelphia despite winning the state by 1.2% and improving Hillary's margin by about 2%. The reason the difference wasn't larger was Philadelphia. Democrats are losing ground, specifically in the more working class areas in Philadelphia, where there's a larger minority population. While Trump is uniquely strong with working class voters and seems to actually do quite well with minority voters, I do believe the trend will end up holding on, just because this is a nationwide thing, as it's not just Trump who's making gains in these groups, Republicans in general are. And when you combine all those factors, and the fact that Trump won the state by 1.7%, it is indicative, in my opinion, that J.D. Vance will win the state, even if he loses a little bit of support in the rural areas. I would say this is probably a Vance plus one state or so, or it could be within 1%. Now, of course, this is subjected to a lot of change. You could see Vance sweeping the Rust Belt, even Minnesota, even New Hampshire, if Trump has a solid term. Vice versa, if Trump's approval rating is 30-something% again, like it was at the end of Trump's term back in 2020, you're obviously going to see a more favorable map for Cory Booker. But as of right now, this is my prediction. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.